Buried in the philosophy of the corpus hermeticum is a claim that overturns everything modern life assumes. Humans aren't separated from the divine, they only believe they are. That belief shapes everything. Entire civilizations rose without ever questioning it. One sentence changed everything. In this journey through the Hermetic Codex, the Emerald Tablet, and the forgotten teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, you will uncover a hidden system of reality, one that describes existence not as physical matter first, but as mental architecture before form appears. Before going further, look at your life for a second. Your goals, your fears, your daily routine. Now ask yourself honestly, did you choose all of it, or did you inherit it? Pause for a moment and look at your thoughts. Not what you think, but how you think. If your perception creates your world, then who is shaping your perception? Chapter 1. The Divine Mind Hidden in Humanity. There is a line preserved in the Hermetic writings that has echoed across centuries like something half-remembered from a dream. The all is mind, not metaphor, not poetry, but a radical claim about existence itself. In the Corpus Hermeticum, reality is not described as a mechanical structure made of matter first. It is described as something far more unsettling, a living field of intelligence, where what we call world is the expression of consciousness thinking itself into form. This changes everything, because if reality is mind-like at its foundation, then human thought is not an internal noise happening inside a skull. It becomes participation in the structure of existence itself. In the old Egyptian temple traditions, there were chambers never spoken about openly. Initiates would enter them not to learn facts, but to undergo a reversal of perception. They were taught to sit in darkness until the mind stopped treating its thoughts as personal possessions. Instead, thoughts were observed as movements, like waves passing through a deeper stillness. One initiation text describes it simply. The student does not think truth into existence. They learn to recognize the mind in which truth already exists. This is where Hermetic philosophy begins, not with belief, but with recognition. That behind every sensation, every interpretation, every internal voice, there is something witnessing it. And that witnessing presence is not passive, it is intelligent, it is aware. It is what the Hermetic tradition calls the divine mind. When the Corpus Hermeticum speaks of humanity, it does not describe beings trapped in matter. It describes beings temporarily unaware of their own source. Not fallen in the moral sense, but distracted from the level of awareness where creation actually begins. Modern life reverses this understanding. It teaches that matter is primary and mind is secondary, that thoughts are reactions to the world. Hermetic teaching reverses this completely. The world is a reflection of mind in motion, not instantly in a magical sense, but continuously through perception, interpretation, and selection of experience. A merchant in ancient Alexandria once recorded a strange realization in a fragmentary journal. He wrote that his fortune did not change when markets changed. It changed when his interpretation of the same events shifted. In periods of fear, he saw threat everywhere and withdrew from opportunity. In periods of clarity, he saw structure where others saw chaos. The external world remained the same, but the world he lived in changed completely. This is the hidden doorway the Hermetic texts point toward. Consciousness is not inside reality observing it. It is the medium through which reality becomes meaningful, and meaning is the first architecture of experience. When the text says, "The all is mind," it is pointing towards something subtle but foundational. Everything you experience is filtered through consciousness before it becomes world. There is no raw reality that is not already interpreted. Even pain is interpreted. Even time is interpreted. Even identity is interpreted, and what is interpreted can be transformed. This is why ancient Hermetic priests did not begin with rituals or external practices. They began with observation. Students were trained to notice how quickly the mind turns neutral events into stories, how instantly perception attaches meaning to sensation. A sound becomes danger, a silence becomes rejection. A delay becomes failure. None of these are facts. They are mental constructions forming instantly. The discipline was not to stop thought, but to see thought clearly enough that it no longer unconsciously dictated experience. Because once thought is seen as movement rather than truth, it loses its invisible authority, and something deeper becomes accessible, awareness itself. In that awareness, there is no confusion, only observation, and from observation, a different kind of intelligence begins to emerge, not reactive intelligence, but reflective intelligence. This is what Hermeticism calls awakening, not acquiring something new, but remembering what was always present beneath mental activity. And here is the practical turning point the tradition always returns to. If consciousness participates in forming experience, then the quality of attention determines the quality of lived reality. So the first discipline is simple, but not easy. Observe thoughts as living forces, not personal identity, not my thoughts define me, but thought is happening, and I am aware of it. Because once thought is seen clearly, it can no longer unconsciously shape perception in the same way. And when thought loses unconscious authority, something extraordinary begins to shift quietly in the background of experience. Chapter 2. Hermes Trismegistus and the Lost Language of Reality. In the ancient world, Hermes Trismegistus was not considered a single man in the modern sense, but a symbol, a fusion of Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth, representing the union of intellect and divine wisdom. He was called the scribe of the gods, not because he recorded divine messages, but because he understood the language through which reality expresses itself. That language, according to Hermetic tradition, is not spoken words, it is perception itself. The Corpus Hermeticum suggests that reality is structured in layers, each layer reflecting a deeper intelligence behind appearances. What we see is not the base level of existence, but the surface expression of something more fundamental. Most people live only on the surface layer. They interact with appearances, events, people, outcomes, without recognizing that each of these is filtered through interpretation before it becomes meaningful. Hermes represents the ability to move between these layers, to see not only what is happening, but how consciousness is shaping what is happening. In one symbolic Hermetic teaching, the initiate is described as entering a temple where mirrors surround every wall. At first, they believe they are seeing multiple worlds. Eventually, they realize they are seeing variations of themselves reflected endlessly. This is not ego symbolism. It is perceptual training. It teaches that reality is not separate from the observer. It is continuously shaped by the structure of awareness itself. Ancient temple initiations were designed around this realization. A student would undergo long periods of sensory limitation, silence, and reflection, not as punishment but as recalibration. Without constant external input, the mind begins to reveal its own role in constructing experience. Thought becomes visible as pattern. Emotion becomes visible as frequency. Interpretation becomes visible as habit. And gradually, the initiate realizes something profound. What they once believed to be world is inseparable from the way they are perceiving it. Hermes Trismegistus is often associated with the phrase, "as above, so below." But in lived practice, this does not refer only to cosmic correspondence. It refers to a psychological truth. The structure of inner awareness shapes the structure of outer experience. When inner perception is fragmented, life feels fragmented. When inner perception is coherent, life feels ordered, even if external conditions have not changed. This is why Hermetic training emphasized discipline of perception above all else, not control of the world, but refinement of interpretation, because interpretation is the bridge between consciousness and experience. A Stoic philosopher would later express a similar idea in simpler terms. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of things. Hermetic teaching goes further, suggesting that this view is not passive, it is creative. It participates in forming the lived reality itself. This is the lost language Hermes represents, the ability to recognize how consciousness translates existence into experience. And once that translation is seen clearly, something shifts. You begin to notice that you are not inside life reacting blindly to it. You are interpreting it continuously, and interpretation is not fixed. It can be refined. This is why Hermetic initiates treated perception as an instrument rather than a reaction. They train themselves to slow down the automatic labeling of experience, to pause between event and interpretation, to see the space where consciousness decides meaning, because in that space, reality is still fluid, and in fluidity, transformation becomes possible. This leads to the practical discipline the tradition leaves behind. Treat perception as a creative instrument, not something that happens to you, but something through which you participate in shaping experience moment by moment, because according to Hermetic wisdom, Hermes does not guard secrets of the universe. He reveals something more unsettling. You have always been participating in its creation, you simply were not aware of it. Chapter 3. The Emerald Tablet and the Mirror of Existence. In the Hermetic tradition, there exists a short and cryptic text known as the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus himself. Though brief in words, its meaning has echoed through centuries like a coded instruction for reality itself. At its center lies a phrase that has been repeated, misunderstood, debated, and yet never exhausted: as above, so below. On the surface it appears poetic, but in Hermetic understanding it is not poetry at all, it is structure. A description of how existence reflects itself across layers of scale, from the vast movements of the cosmos down to the subtle patterns of human awareness. The macrocosm and microcosm are not separate domains. They are reflections of the same underlying intelligence expressed at different levels of complexity. Ancient alchemists did not interpret this as a physical claim alone. They saw it as a psychological law. The outer world does not simply happen. It echoes inner organization. A fragmented mind experiences fragmented reality. A divided attention perceives contradiction everywhere. A calm and coherent awareness encounters continuity even in chaos. This is not imagination. It is perception organizing experience. There is a recorded parable from an early Hermetic-influenced school in Alexandria. A student once complained that the world around him was unstable. People were unpredictable. Circumstances constantly shifting, opportunities appearing and disappearing without logic. The teacher listened and said nothing. Instead, he handed the student a polished metal bowl filled with water and told him to walk through the city without spilling a drop. At first, the student believed it was a test of balance, but soon he realized something deeper. Every external movement forced him to adjust internally. His attention narrowed, his reactions slowed, his awareness became unified. The world did not change, but his relationship to it did. When he returned, the teacher asked what he had observed. The student replied, "When I became steady inside, the world became easier to move through." The teacher answered, "You were not learning balance in your body, you were witnessing the reflection of your mind." This is the emerald tablet in lived form. Reality reflects the structure of consciousness, not as punishment, not as reward, but as correspondence. When Hermetic teaching speaks of alchemy, it is often misread as turning base metals into gold. But within the inner tradition, the metal being transformed is perception itself. Fear becomes clarity when seen without identification. Confusion becomes insight when observed without resistance. Emotional turbulence becomes intelligence when stabilized instead of suppressed. Alchemy, in this sense, is the refinement of inner reaction, because inner reaction determines outer interpretation, and outer interpretation determines lived experience. Modern psychology now echoes this principle in different language. Cognitive patterns shape perception. Emotional states bias interpretation. Attention filters reality. But Hermetic teaching goes further by insisting that these are not just mental effects. They are participatory forces in how reality is experienced as a whole. Order disorder does not remain private. It organizes perception outwardly, which means life often appears chaotic, not because the world is chaotic, but because awareness is fragmented while observing it. This is why Hermetic discipline emphasizes stabilization before action, not suppression of emotion, but clarity within emotion. A mind in reaction cannot see accurately. It projects distortion onto experience. A mind in stability sees more clearly what is actually present, and clarity changes decisions before circumstances ever shift. So the action hidden within this ancient principle is simple. Stabilize inner reactions before responding to life, because reaction is where perception is most vulnerable to distortion. And perception is where reality becomes meaningful. Chapter 4. The principle of mental transmutation. In the Hermetic schools of antiquity, there was a principle never written in plain language for outsiders, yet whispered in symbolic form across texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It is the idea that consciousness is not fixed substance, it is transmutable energy. The corpus hermeticum does not describe the mind as something that merely reacts to life. It describes it as something capable of reshaping its internal state so completely that perception itself changes. This is what later Hermetic writers called mental transmutation, the ability to convert one form of inner experience into another through conscious direction, fear into clarity, confusion into order, reaction into awareness. But this was never presented as theory. It was treated as discipline. In one preserved tradition from the Egyptian-influenced mystery schools, initiates were placed in deliberately uncomfortable situations, not to harm them, but to reveal something subtle. The mind does not respond directly to events, it responds to its interpretation of events. A student once entered a chamber filled with dim light and echoing sound. He was told nothing except to remain still and observe what arose within him. At first fear appeared, then resistance, then stories formed in his mind about danger, uncertainty, loss of control. But as time passed, something unexpected happened. Nothing outside changed, but his interpretation did. The fear did not vanish. It transformed into observation. The unknown stopped being a threat and became a field of attention. The teacher later told him, "You were not inside darkness. You were inside your interpretation of darkness." This is the Hermetic insight behind mental transmutation. The world does not directly generate emotional states. Emotional states arise from meaning assigned to experience, and meaning is constructed, which means it can be reconstructed. Modern psychology now describes similar mechanisms: cognitive reframing, emotional regulation, attentional control. But Hermetic teaching frames it more radically, not as therapy, but as alchemy of awareness, because in this view, energy follows attention, and attention follows interpretation. If interpretation changes, emotional energy reorganizes itself. This is why initiates trained not to suppress fear, but to redirect it. Fear, when unconscious, narrows perception. It collapses possibility into limitation. But when observed consciously, it can sharpen awareness instead of destroying it. A frightened mind says, something is wrong. A transmuting mind says, something is being revealed. The same energy, different direction. This is the hidden discipline. Not control of external reality, but transformation of internal response before it solidifies into action. Because action taken from untransformed emotion becomes repetition of old patterns, but action taken from transmuted emotion becomes creation. So the action embedded here is precise. Consciously shift emotional state in real time, not later, not after understanding fully. But in the moment, awareness notices contraction, because that moment is the threshold where consciousness either repeats pattern or rewrites it. And Hermetic teaching insists, mastery is not absence of emotion, but fluidity within it. Chapter 5. The Subconscious as Sacred Receiver. In the teachings associated with Joseph Murphy and earlier Hermetic parallels, there is a recurring idea that the subconscious mind does not argue. It does not evaluate truth. It does not distinguish between imagination and reality in the way the conscious mind does. It simply receives what is repeatedly impressed upon it, especially when that impression carries emotional weight. This principle appears modern in language, but ancient in structure. In temple traditions across Egypt, and later mystery schools influenced by Hermetic thought, repetition was not accidental. It was a tool of inner formation. Sacred phrases were repeated not to inform the mind, but to condition identity itself, because identity, once formed, becomes the lens through which behavior organizes itself. A young initiate in one tradition was required to repeat a single symbolic statement daily, not as belief, but as embodied declaration. At first it felt false, then mechanical, then gradually something subtle shifted. Behavior began aligning with repetition without conscious effort. The teaching was simple. What is emotionally repeated becomes psychologically accepted, and what is accepted becomes lived reality. Modern psychology echoes this through habit formation and neural reinforcement. But Hermetic interpretation frames it as deeper. The subconscious is not just memory storage. It is a shaping field that organizes perception according to dominant emotional imprinting. This is why emotionalized thought is more powerful than neutral thought. Neutral thought passes through awareness. Emotional thought enters identity. If fear is repeatedly impressed with emotion, the subconscious begins to organize experience around caution, limitation, and avoidance. If clarity, confidence, or direction is repeatedly impressed, behavior begins to align accordingly without conscious force. This is not mysticism in the abstract. It is structural conditioning of inner reality. And ancient initiates understood this intuitively. That is why rituals were designed with repetition, rhythm, and emotional engagement, not as superstition, but as psychological imprinting. They were training the subconscious to accept a different version of self, because once identity changes, perception changes, and once perception changes, reality appears different. not because the external world transformed instantly, but because the interpreter of that world has shifted. A traveler once recorded in a Hermetic-influenced fragment that he returned to the same city after years of inner discipline and felt as though it had changed. Streets were familiar, but experience was not. Opportunities appeared where previously there were none. Obstacles felt less absolute. He concluded something striking. I did not enter a different city. I entered a different version of myself. This is the essence of subconscious conditioning, not control of the external world, but restructuring the internal receiver through which the world is processed. And the most direct method described across traditions is repetition with emotional consistency, not occasional affirmation, but sustained identity alignment. This leads to the practical Hermetic instruction embedded in this principle: speak identity-aligned statements daily, not as wishful thinking, but as intentional conditioning of inner structure, because every repeated statement is not just communication, it is imprinting, and every imprint shapes the subconscious architecture through which experience is filtered. So over time, the internal narrative becomes the organizing force behind external behavior, and external behavior becomes the bridge through which reality appears to respond. But the deeper truth, according to Hermetic wisdom, is more subtle. Reality is not responding to words alone, it is responding to the identity being formed through repetition. And identity is shaped most deeply not by what is said once, by what is impressed again and again until it becomes invisible assumption. Chapter 6. The Fall of Human Awareness. There is a fragment in ancient mystical storytelling that describes a being once aware of its own divine nature, clear, unburdened, and connected to a vast intelligence underlying existence. But over time, that awareness narrows, not through punishment, through forgetting. The being becomes absorbed in its own creation, its thoughts, interpretations, desires, and fears, until it no longer recognizes the field in which those experiences arise. And in that forgetting, something fundamental shifts. Reality is no longer experienced as participation in a larger intelligence. It becomes personal struggle. This is the fall described in many philosophical and mystical traditions, not a physical descent, but a perceptual one. A contraction of awareness into identification with fragments instead of the whole. In this state, consciousness begins to believe it is isolated inside experience rather than expressing experience through itself. And once that belief takes hold, everything changes. Stress becomes heavier. Fear becomes more convincing. Meaning becomes distorted because perception is now filtered through limitation rather than awareness. A small parable from ancient contemplative schools describes a man walking through a vast hall filled with mirrors. At first he sees endless reflections of himself and believes he is surrounded by others. Over time, he forgets he is in a hall of reflection. He begins reacting to every image as if it is separate from him. Eventually, he becomes exhausted by his own reflections, not realizing he is standing in the center of all of them. The teacher watching him says quietly, "He has not lost himself. He has forgotten where he is standing." This is the psychological essence of human confusion in Hermetic language, not loss of divinity, but loss of orientation within awareness. Modern psychology might describe this as identification with mental content rather than observer consciousness. Ancient teachings describe it more symbolically, forgetting the source while being surrounded by its expression, and this forgetting is subtle. It does not feel like loss. It feels like normal life. But its effect is profound. Awareness becomes trapped inside interpretation loops. Thought generates emotion. Emotion reinforces belief. Belief filters perception. Perception confirms thought, a closed circle. This is how limitation feels self-evident, but in Hermetic and contemplative traditions, the way out is not force. It is remembrance, not intellectual remembering, but perceptual remembering. The shift back into awareness of awareness itself. When this shift occurs, even briefly, something destabilizes in the habitual structure of experience. Thoughts are still present, but they are no longer central. Emotions still arise, but they are no longer totalizing. Identity still functions, but it is no longer absolute. A space opens, and in that space, a different kind of intelligence becomes accessible. Not reactive intelligence, observing intelligence. This is why ancient teachings often begin not with instruction but with interruption, methods designed to break identification long enough for awareness to recognize itself again. Silence, contemplation, withdrawal, reflection, not escape from life, but exit from unconscious participation in it. Because forgetting, in Hermetic terms, is the first prison, not moral failure, not spiritual punishment, but simply narrowing of awareness until only fragments of existence are visible. And once a person believes fragments are all there is, limitation becomes naturalized. So the action embedded in this teaching is subtle but profound. Remember that awareness is larger than what it is currently focused on, because the moment awareness recognizes its own depth, even briefly, the structure of limitation begins to loosen, and what was once experienced as confinement begins to feel like a system within something far greater, not escape from life, but return to the field in which life is happening. Chapter 7. The Upanishads and Illusion of Identity. In the ancient Upanishadic teachings of India, there is a quiet but radical insight that reshapes everything a human being assumes about themselves. It is the idea of Maya, not as simple illusion but as conditioned perception, a veil not over the world but over the way the world is interpreted. The Upanishads do not begin by asking what reality is made of. They begin by asking a more uncomfortable question: who is the one experiencing reality? Because in their view, the deepest deception is not what is seen, but what is assumed to be the seer. Identity, in this framework, is not fixed truth. It is constructed narrative, a layered story repeated long enough that it feels inherent. A person does not simply have thoughts about themselves. They begin to become those thoughts through repetition, emotion, and identification. I am not enough. I always struggle. I am this kind of person. Over time, these are no longer statements. They become structure. And that structure filters everything that follows. There is a subtle but profound distinction in the Upanishads between personality and awareness. Personality is described as a changing pattern, formed by memory, conditioning, and environment. Awareness, however, is described as the witnessing presence beneath all patterns. Most human suffering, according to this view, comes from confusing the pattern with the witness. A story preserved in contemplative tradition tells of a young seeker who approached a sage claiming he wished to find his true self. The sage asked him to describe who he believed he was. The seeker listed his roles, his memories, his achievements, and his failures. The sage listened and then said quietly, "You have described everything you are aware of, but not the awareness itself." The seeker became confused. "Then who am I?" The sage replied, "You are not what you describe. You are what remains when description stops." This points to a core Upanishadic insight. Consciousness is prior to identity. Identity is layered on top of awareness, not identical with it. And because identity is layered, it can also be restructured. Most people, however, never question the layer, they only live inside it. They assume the narrative is the self, rather than recognizing it as a construct formed through repetition and interpretation. This is why identity shapes reality so strongly. Not because it directly alters the external world, but because it determines what is noticed, how events are interpreted, and what actions feel natural. A contracted identity perceives limitation as normal. An expanded identity perceives possibility as natural. The external world may remain unchanged, but the internal filter through which it is experienced is entirely different. This is the subtle architecture of Maya, not false reality, but incomplete perception mistaken for totality. And the action hidden within this teaching is simple but destabilizing. Question inherited identity structures, not to destroy them, but to recognize that they are constructed, because once identity is seen as constructed, it loses absolute authority, and when it loses absolute authority, awareness becomes free to reorganize itself. Chapter 8. Why change fails without identity shift. Most people attempt change at the level of action. They try new habits, new routines, new systems, new goals, and yet something quietly resists lasting transformation. The reason is rarely effort, it is identity. Ancient initiatory traditions understood this clearly. Action without identity shift produces temporary movement, not structural change. Because behavior does not originate from intention alone. It originates from what the mind assumes to be true about itself. A person who identifies internally as inconsistent will eventually disrupt consistency. A person who identifies as someone who struggles will unconsciously interpret neutral events as struggle. Not because they want to, but because identity organizes perception to confirm itself. This is why motivation often fails. Motivation is emotional energy without structural foundation. It can initiate movement, but it cannot maintain it when emotional intensity fades. Identity, however, persists beyond emotion. It acts as a baseline assumption that quietly determines what feels like me. There is an old teaching from initiatory philosophy that describes two travelers attempting the same journey. One carries determination alone. The other carries a transformed sense of self. At the beginning, both move with equal intensity. But over time, the first begins to struggle. The effort feels heavier. Resistance increases. Eventually, the journey stops. The second traveler, however, continues with less visible strain, not because the path is easier, but because movement aligns with identity. It does not require constant internal negotiation. The teaching concludes, one acted against himself, the other acted as himself. This is the hidden difference. When identity is unchanged, action must constantly overcome internal contradiction. But when identity shifts, action becomes natural expression. This is why emotional inconsistency weakens outcomes. The mind sends conflicting signals. Desire in one moment, doubt in another. Motivation in one moment, resistance in the next. The result is fragmentation of direction, and fragmented direction produces unstable results. Ancient initiates address this not by increasing effort, but by reconstructing self-image first. They did not ask, "What must I do to change?" They asked, "Who must I be for change to feel inevitable?" This is a reversal of common thinking, because when identity stabilizes, behavior aligns without force. Decisions feel clearer, choices feel obvious. Resistance reduces not because challenges disappear, but because internal contradiction dissolves. Modern psychology echoes this in different language. Self-concept determines behavior more strongly than intention. But ancient teachings framed it more directly. You do not attract or achieve what you want, you express what you assume yourself to be. So if identity remains unchanged, change remains superficial, temporary, reversible. But when identity shifts, even small actions compound into irreversible direction. This leads to the central action of this principle. Stabilize identity before goal pursuit, not through denial of current reality, but through conscious formation of internal assumption, because identity is not what you declare once. It is what your mind continuously returns to when no effort is being made. And whatever it returns to quietly becomes the foundation of your lived experience. Chapter 9. The Return to the Divine Mind. The journey in many ancient philosophical systems does not move outward indefinitely. It circles back, not because there is nowhere else to go, but because what was sought externally was always rooted internally. The journey ends where it began, say the contemplative traditions, not as poetic metaphor, but as experiential realization. Within. In Hermetic thought, this is expressed through the idea that the divine mind is not separate from human awareness, but the substrate in which all experience appears. The Corpus Hermeticum repeatedly emphasizes that what we perceive as external reality is in essence a manifestation within consciousness itself. To return to the divine mind, therefore, is not to travel somewhere else, but to recognize the source from which perception arises. There is a subtle story preserved in mystical teaching circles about a seeker who spent decades searching for truth. He traveled across lands, studied under many teachers, endured hardship, and collected knowledge. Yet the sense of completion never arrived. One night, exhausted, he sat alone in silence and stopped searching. In that moment, nothing new appeared, but everything changed. He later described it not as discovery, but as recognition. I was not entering something new. I was noticing what was always present. This is the essence of return, not acquisition but remembrance. Modern psychology might describe this as a shift from identification with content to awareness of consciousness itself. Ancient traditions describe it more symbolically as alignment with divine mind, logos, or universal intelligence. Regardless of terminology, the underlying transformation is consistent. The sense of separation weakens. And when separation weakens, interpretation changes, events still occur, life continues, challenges still arise, but they no longer feel like isolated disruptions. They are experienced within a broader field of awareness that is stable beneath change. This stability is what ancient Stoics referred to as inner sovereignty. It is not control over external events, but clarity within them. When attention is no longer fully absorbed by external fluctuations, perception becomes spacious, and within that space, responses become more deliberate, less reactive. This is why inward turning is not withdrawal from reality, it is recentering within it, because outward seeking assumes truth is elsewhere. Inward recognition reveals that truth was the condition in which seeking itself was happening. This realization subtly dissolves the urgency of pursuit, not because life loses meaning, but because meaning is no longer dependent on external acquisition. And here, a quiet but powerful shift occurs. The mind stops trying to extract certainty from the external world and begins to rest in the awareness that perceives it. That resting is what many traditions call return. Return to the source, return to awareness. Return to divine mind, not as concept, but as lived recognition. And the action that follows this realization is not effortful transformation, but inward orientation. Look inward, not outward, not to reject the world, but to recognize the field in which the world is experienced. Because when awareness returns to its own source, perception reorganizes itself naturally, and what once felt distant begins to feel immediate, not because reality changed, but because the observer remembered where reality was always appearing. Chapter 10. Law of correspondence in daily life. Within Hermetic philosophy, one principle appears simple on the surface, yet becomes increasingly profound the more it is lived. As above, so below. As within, so without. This is the law of correspondence, but in practice, it is not a poetic statement. It is a diagnostic lens through which experience can be read. It suggests that the outer structure of a person's life often mirrors the inner structure of their consciousness, not in literal one-to-one symbolism, but in pattern, tone, and repetition, or order tends to produce outer coherence, or fragmentation tends to produce outer instability, not as punishment, not as reward, but as reflection. There is an old Hermetic-style teaching story of a craftsman who built intricate glass vessels. He noticed something strange. No matter how precise his tools or materials were, the final shape of the glass always carried subtle distortions. At first he blamed the furnace, then the sand, then the wind, but an elder observer asked him to watch his own hands more closely. He discovered something unsettling. When his attention was calm, the glass formed evenly. When his thoughts were agitated, rushed, or uncertain, tiny distortions appeared in the structure, almost invisible at first, but always present. The lesson was not about glass, it was about transmission. In Hermetic psychology, the human being is not separate from the conditions they experience. They are continuously participating in shaping those conditions through attention, emotional tone, and internal coherence. This does not mean every event is directly caused by thought in a simplistic way. Rather, it means that sustained internal states influence perception, interpretation, decision-making, and behavioral repetition until external outcomes begin to reflect those patterns. A person who repeatedly carries internal tension will begin to interpret neutral situations as threatening. That interpretation changes behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. And over time, life begins to resemble the internal state that initiated the cycle. This is correspondence in motion. Even ancient Stoic thinkers touched this principle from another angle. They observed that suffering is often not rooted in events themselves, but in judgments layered onto events. The same external condition can produce clarity in one mind and chaos in another. The difference is internal structure, and internal structure is not formed in a single moment. It is formed through repetition. Repeated emotional reactions become habitual perception. Habitual perception becomes identity. Identity becomes lived experience. This is why the Hermetic approach does not begin with external correction. It begins with internal observation. Because the inner state is not separate from life, it is the blueprint through which life is continuously interpreted. A person does not merely see reality. They filter it. And that filter is shaped by emotional memory, unconscious belief, and repeated reaction patterns. When anger is the dominant internal response, the world appears more hostile. When fear is dominant, the world appears more uncertain. When grounded awareness is dominant, the world appears more navigable. The outer world is not changing its essence in each case, but the experience of it is entirely transformed. This is the hidden psychological layer of correspondence. Perception itself is structured by inner continuity, and what is continuously reinforced inside eventually becomes externally visible in the form of choices, relationships, and outcomes. This is why ancient initiatory systems placed such emphasis on inner discipline, not as moral restriction, but as reality alignment. They understood that without internal order, external mastery collapses into instability, so the action emerges clearly. Master internal reactions first. Not suppressing emotion, but becoming aware of the pattern before it becomes behavior. Because once a reaction becomes automatic, it begins to shape reality without conscious participation. But when the reaction is observed before expression, the pattern becomes visible, and what becomes visible can be transformed. This is where correspondence becomes practical wisdom rather than abstract philosophy. Life begins to reveal itself as feedback, not randomness. Chapter 11. The Kybalion versus True Hermeticism. Modern interpretations of Hermetic thought often present it as a simplified system of mental laws, quick principles, distilled phrases, and symbolic affirmations meant to suggest control over reality. But this modern framing, while accessible, often misses the deeper current beneath it. The original Hermetic tradition was not primarily about control. It was about alignment with intelligence larger than the personal mind. The Corpus Hermeticum does not present reality as something to be forced or manipulated. It presents reality as something to be understood, and through understanding, harmonized with. This is a critical distinction, because when Hermetic ideas are reduced to surface-level formulas, they can create the illusion that reality is mechanically responsive to thought alone. But in the original texts, consciousness is not depicted as isolated command. It is participation within a living, intelligent field. There is a quiet difference between the idea of controlling reality and aligning with the structure of reality. One is forceful, the other is receptive clarity. A traditional Hermetic teaching speaks of the mind as a reflection of the divine mind, not separate, not superior, but embedded within it. The human mind does not stand outside existence and direct it like an external force. It operates within the same continuum of intelligence that structures existence itself. This is why ancient Hermetic writings emphasize purification of perception, clarity of understanding, and refinement of awareness more than mere outcome manipulation. Even in Asclepius, one of the foundational Hermetic texts, the focus is on recognizing the divine order within creation rather than bending creation through will alone. In contrast, modern simplifications often extract the law-like language and present it as if the universe operates like a mechanism responding directly to mental commands. While there is symbolic truth in the idea that consciousness influences experience, the deeper teaching is subtler. Consciousness participates in interpretation, and interpretation shapes lived reality. This distinction matters psychologically because when teachings are oversimplified into control models, they can create pressure, expectation, and frustration when reality does not respond in linear ways. But when understood through their original philosophical depth, they become tools for self-observation rather than control obsession. There is also a deeper historical irony here. Hermetic wisdom itself warned against mistaking symbolic language for literal mechanism. Much of it was intentionally encoded in metaphor to guide transformation of awareness, not just accumulation of technique. A seeker who reads only for control misses the initiatory intent entirely. A seeker who reads for understanding begins to notice something different. Patterns of thought, emotional conditioning, and perception itself become visible as objects of awareness. And that visibility is where transformation actually begins, because what is seen clearly can no longer operate unconsciously. This is the true Hermetic movement, not domination of reality, but dissolution of unconscious interpretation loops that distort experience. So the deeper takeaway is simple but counterintuitive. Go to the source. Not just historically, but experientially, return to the original intent behind the teachings: awareness, alignment, and inner clarity, not external manipulation. Because when Hermetic wisdom is approached at its root level, it stops being a system for forcing outcomes and becomes a mirror for refining consciousness itself. Chapter 12. The Return to Inner Authority. At the deepest level of Hermetic and Stoic thought, there is a quiet but radical reversal of how most people understand control, not control over events, but control over participation in interpretation. Because what a human being experiences as reality is not raw existence, it is existence filtered through consciousness, shaped by attention, emotion, memory, and assumption. To return to inner authority is to recognize a difficult truth. You are not merely inside life. Life is also being continuously formed inside you. This does not grant external domination over circumstances. Instead, it reveals something far more subtle. You are constantly involved in shaping the meaning and emotional tone of what unfolds. The Stoics understood this with unusual clarity. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the middle of war, political instability, and plague, did not describe a world he could control. He described a mind he could govern. And in that governance he found a different kind of sovereignty, one that external chaos could not easily dismantle. He wrote, in essence, that if the mind remains clear, even chaos becomes intelligible. But if the mind is clouded, even order feels like suffering. This is inner authority, not denial of difficulty, but stability within it. Hermetic philosophy extends this idea further. It suggests that consciousness is not a passive receiver of reality, but a participating intelligence within a greater universal mind. This does not mean individual thoughts reshape the universe at will. It means interpretation, perception, and meaning-making are active forces that determine lived experience. Two people can stand in the same moment of life and inhabit entirely different worlds, not because reality changed, but because consciousness did. There is an ancient teaching story of a gatekeeper in a forgotten city temple. Travelers would arrive from distant lands, exhausted and uncertain. Some would enter the temple and feel immediate peace. Others would enter the same space and feel unease, suspicion, or confusion. The gatekeeper was asked why the temple seemed to affect people differently. He answered, "The temple does not change. The visitor does." This is the essence of inner authority. The external field is not the primary variable. The internal state is. And yet, most people spend their lives attempting to stabilize external conditions while leaving internal reactions unexamined. Hermetic and Stoic traditions reverse this priority. They suggest that internal order is not a byproduct of external stability. It is the cause of how stability is experienced. When inner reactions are impulsive, fragmented, or unconscious, external events feel chaotic even when they are manageable. When inner reactions are grounded, deliberate, and observed, external instability becomes something navigable rather than overwhelming. This is not mystical abstraction, it is psychological structure. Attention determines interpretation. Interpretation determines emotion. Emotion determines behavior. Behavior determines life trajectory. So the origin point is always internal governance. To govern thoughts deliberately does not mean suppressing mental activity. It means developing the capacity to observe it before identification occurs. A thought appears, it is seen, it is not immediately obeyed. In that small gap, authority emerges. This is where ancient teachings converge, not in controlling everything that arises in the mind, but in refusing unconscious surrender to everything that arises, because the unobserved mind reacts. The observed mind responds, and response is the foundation of sovereignty. To return to inner authority is therefore to reclaim the position of observer within experience, not as detached escape, but as conscious participation. You are no longer carried entirely by mental currents. You begin to see them forming, and once seen clearly, they lose their invisible dominance. This is where alignment with what ancient texts call universal intelligence becomes meaningful, not as external force acting upon you, but as coherence between awareness and the structure of experience itself. When inner order increases, perception becomes less distorted. And when perception becomes less distorted, decisions become more aligned with reality rather than fear-based interpretation. That alignment is what produces what people later describe as stable outcomes. Not magic, clarity. So the return to inner authority is not a moment of arrival, it is a practice of continuous recognition. Each thought observed, each reaction witnessed, each assumption examined. This is governance of the inner world, and from that governance everything else begins to reorganize in a quieter, more natural way. Chapter 13. The Final Law of Vibration. At the core of Hermetic philosophy lies a principle that modern language often simplifies, but ancient understanding treated with far more depth. Everything is in motion, and nothing remains psychologically or perceptually static. The principle of vibration is not merely about energy in a physical sense. It refers to the continuous movement of consciousness itself, thoughts arising, emotions shifting, interpretations forming, dissolving, and reforming. Reality as experienced by the human mind is not a fixed image. It is a dynamic field of perception shaped moment by moment. And within this field, one factor consistently determines how reality is experienced: the emotional tone of consciousness, not emotion as isolated reaction, but emotion as an atmosphere, a background frequency through which everything is interpreted. There is a subtle but profound truth hidden here. Thoughts do not operate alone. They generate emotional coloring, and that emotional coloring becomes the lens through which life is perceived. A neutral event, when filtered through anxiety, becomes threat. The same event, filtered through clarity, becomes information. The event did not change. The vibrational state of perception did. Ancient teachings expressed this idea symbolically rather than mechanically. They understood that consciousness emits a kind of interpretive resonance. What you consistently feel becomes the structure through which experience is organized. This is why emotional repetition is more influential than isolated thought. One thought does not define reality. A sustained emotional state begins to shape the architecture of perception, and over time, perception influences behavior so consistently that external outcomes begin to align with internal tone, not as punishment, not as reward, but as continuity. There is an old teaching story from contemplative tradition about a student who complained that his world seemed chaotic and unpredictable. The master instructed him to observe only one thing for 30 days. Not events, but his emotional responses to events. At first, the student believed nothing would change. Life still presented difficulties. Conversations still felt unpredictable. Situations still arose without warning. But as days passed, something shifted, not outside him, but within his recognition. He began to see that the same external situation could produce multiple internal realities, depending on his emotional response. What had once felt like chaos began to reveal a hidden structure. His experience was not random, it was reactive, And once seen, reaction began to loosen its unconscious grip. This is the purpose of observation, not control of events, but awareness of internal vibration. Because what is repeatedly felt becomes the emotional atmosphere of identity. And identity shapes perception, perception shapes decision, decision shapes direction. So the so-called law of vibration is not about forcing a frequency. It is about noticing the one already active within you. This is why the final instruction is not effort, but awareness. Track thoughts, emotions, and reactions daily, not as judgment, not as correction, but as revelation, because what you repeatedly notice begins to lose unconscious power over you, and what becomes conscious begins to change naturally, not through force, but through clarity. This is the final movement of Hermetic understanding, realization that transformation is not primarily addition, but observation, not becoming something else, but seeing what has been shaping experience all along. And in that seeing, vibration ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes lived awareness. The atmosphere of the mind becomes visible, and once visible, it can no longer silently govern experience in the same way again. The ancient texts never promised power, they revealed responsibility. Most people search outside. Few turn inward, and fewer still persist long enough to remember who they are. Chapter 14. The Illusion of the Material World. What if the very thing you are chasing is also what keeps you from seeing clearly? This question sits at the heart of many ancient philosophical traditions, from Greek metaphysics to Eastern contemplative systems. It is not a rejection of the material world, but a reinterpretation of its role in human perception. In Hermetic and Platonic thought, the material world is not denied as fake, but understood as secondary, a reflection rather than a source, a surface rather than the depth beneath it. And yet, most human attention becomes anchored entirely to the surface. Desire narrows vision, fear narrows vision even further. And when vision narrows, reality feels more solid than it actually is, fixed, heavy, absolute. There is an old parable attributed to contemplative schools of antiquity. A traveler enters a vast marketplace filled with merchants shouting, offering, demanding attention. Gold, status, food, tools, everything appears urgent, necessary, and limited. The traveler becomes overwhelmed and begins to run from stall to stall, trying to secure what seems essential. But the more he runs, the more confused he becomes. Prices seem higher, choices multiply, pressure increases. Eventually he collapses in exhaustion and looks up. From a distance, an elder watching the scene says quietly, "He is not lost in the marketplace. He is lost in the belief that everything there is equally real." This is the subtle illusion, not that the material world does not exist, but that everything within it demands equal psychological weight. Ancient Stoics, Hermetic philosophers, and even early mystical traditions converge on this insight in different language. Attachment distorts perception. When the mind clings tightly to outcomes, it begins to interpret every event through anxiety. Neutral situations become threats. Temporary delays become permanent loss. Opportunities become invisible because attention is already locked onto fear-driven conclusions. This is why chasing often becomes paradoxical. The more tightly something is pursued, the more it appears to recede, not because reality is resisting, but because perception is narrowing under tension. There is also a deeper psychological layer here. What is chased externally often reflects an internal lack of stability. The mind assumes completion lies out there, and so attention becomes externally anchored. But external anchoring creates dependency, and dependency creates emotional volatility. Ancient teachings repeatedly emphasize a counter-principle: Clarity arises when identification loosens, not rejection of life, but non-grasping participation in it. To detach does not mean to abandon desire or action. It means to loosen the unconscious belief that fulfillment is located exclusively in external acquisition. When this loosening occurs, perception expands, and expanded perception reveals something subtle but powerful. Options were always present but previously unseen. This is why many traditions teach withdrawal, not as escape, but as recalibration. The monk does not withdraw from the world to avoid it, but to see it without distortion. Even in Plato's philosophical framework, the shift from shadows to forms requires a kind of detachment from immediate sensory certainty. The cave prisoner must stop trusting what feels most obvious in order to perceive what is more real. And this is where the action emerges, detached to see clearly, not emotionally numb detachment, but perceptual freedom, a state where desire no longer blinds interpretation and fear no longer dictates meaning. Because what you chase without clarity often becomes what traps you in repetition. But when attention loosens its grip, reality stops appearing as a closed system and begins to reveal movement, possibility, and space. There is a strange moment in every seeker's journey when everything they were chasing suddenly feels closer than they expected, not because it arrived, but because the illusion of distance collapses. All the ancient systems, Hermeticism, Stoicism, Platonic philosophy, Eastern non-duality, early psychology, begin to converge on a single unsettling idea. Nothing was ever truly outside you, not experience, not meaning, not the way life feels as it unfolds. The conclusion of this entire body of wisdom is not a new technique, not a hidden ritual, not another mental formula to apply. It is something far more destabilizing to the conditioned mind. You are already participating in the structure of your reality through the simple fact of awareness. And because of that, nothing you experience is separate from the way you are present within it. This is where ancient teachings begin to sound less like philosophy and more like memory, as if something forgotten is being re-encountered rather than learned. Hermes Trismegistus never spoke like a teacher handing down instructions. The tone of the Hermetic texts feels more like recognition, an insistence that what is being described is already happening beneath the noise of ordinary perception. Plato's cave does not describe a fictional situation. It describes attention itself, how consciousness mistakes shadows of interpretation for reality, then reacts to those shadows as if they were absolute truth. Marcus Aurelius does not speak as someone trying to escape life. He speaks as someone realizing that the mind is the only place where life is actually experienced, and the Upanishadic sages do not search outward for divinity. They declare something even more radical. The witness of experience is already what you are looking for. So the conclusion is not addition, it is removal. Not accumulation, but recognition. And recognition changes everything without forcing anything. If you strip away all symbolic language, all mystical framing, all ancient terminology, you arrive at something psychologically simple yet profound. Human experience is shaped by three continuous layers. 1. Attention. 2. Interpretation. 3. Identification. Attention selects what is noticed. Interpretation assigns meaning. Identification decides this is happening to me. These three processes operate so quickly that most people believe they are seeing reality directly, but they are not. They are experiencing processed reality. This is why two people can live through the same event and leave with entirely different psychological worlds. One sees rejection, one sees redirection, one sees failure. One sees feedback, the event is identical, the internal structure is not, and that internal structure is not fixed. It is learned, reinforced, repeated, and eventually mistaken for truth. This is the invisible architecture ancient traditions were pointing toward, not external control, but internal pattern recognition, because once you recognize the pattern, it no longer operates in the dark. There is an old teaching story, preserved in variations across mystical traditions, about a traveler who sought a hidden temple said to contain the voice of truth. He walked for years, crossing deserts and mountains, following fragmented instructions passed down by different teachers. Each teacher added new conditions: purify yourself, memorize prayers, master discipline, endure hardship, prove worthiness. Eventually, the traveler reached a final gate deep within a mountain monastery. Inside there was no grand ceremony, no divine figure, no revelation in the way he expected, only silence. An old keeper of the temple sat near an empty hall and said nothing for a long time. Finally, the traveler asked, "Where is the voice of truth?" The keeper pointed, not outward but inward. The traveler laughed nervously, expecting a riddle. "Inside what?" the keeper replied. "Inside the one who keeps asking." At first this sounds like poetic mysticism, but psychologically it is precise. The voice of truth was never an external signal to be found. It was the capacity of awareness itself when it is no longer fully absorbed in its own interpretations. The traveler had been searching for something new to enter his life, when what he needed was to notice the field in which all experience was already appearing. This is the shift every tradition quietly leads toward, from seeking to seeing, from acquiring to recognizing, from control to awareness. And in that shift, something remarkable happens. The need to chase external transformation begins to dissolve, because the source of transformation is seen as internal participation in experience itself. One of the most confusing experiences in human life is this: even when change happens, it often does not last. New habits fade, motivation collapses, insight becomes memory instead of living reality. Why? Ancient psychology would answer in a way modern thinking often overlooks. Because behavior is not the root system of identity. Identity is. You cannot permanently override identity with effort alone. Effort operates at the surface layer of consciousness. Identity operates at the structural layer. So when effort conflicts with identity, identity eventually reasserts itself. This is why Stoic discipline was never just about acting differently. It was about seeing differently, because once perception changes, behavior no longer requires force. This is also why Hermetic teachings emphasize mental alignment rather than physical manipulation, and why Plato separates appearance from form, not to dismiss the world, but to highlight that perception is always structured by deeper organizing principles. So the instability people experience in change is not failure. It is mismatch between what they are doing and what they believe themselves to be. At a certain point in deep reflection, something unexpected begins to happen. The outer world starts to feel less solid than it once did, not in a delusional sense, but in a perceptual sense. Events begin to appear less like isolated occurrences and more like responses within a continuous field of interpretation. This is what mystical traditions call awakening, but psychology might simply call increased meta-awareness. The ability to observe one's own interpretive process while it is happening. You begin to notice how quickly you assign meaning, how emotionally interpretation arises before logic, how memory shapes expectation, how expectation filters perception. And once you see this clearly, something subtle shifts. You stop believing every interpretation automatically. This is the beginning of inner freedom, not freedom from life, but freedom within perception. The outer world does not disappear, but its authority weakens. It becomes one layer among others, not the final authority over your emotional state. All Hermetic teachings eventually circle back to one idea. You are not separate from the process you are trying to understand. You are inside it, and it is inside you. This does not mean you control everything. It means you are always involved in how everything is experienced. There is a profound difference. Control assumes separation. Participation assumes unity. Control creates pressure. Participation creates awareness. When this is fully understood, not intellectually but experientially, the entire pursuit of forcing reality begins to soften. Not because life becomes passive, but because consciousness becomes attentive, and attention is more powerful than force in shaping experience. Why? Because attention determines what becomes real enough to influence action, and action is where outcomes begin to form. So the true law behind all these teachings is not manipulation. It is awareness of participation. If all symbolic language is stripped away, what remains is practice, not belief, not philosophy, but observation. For the next 30 days, the ancient instruction would be surprisingly simple. Observe your mind as if it is not you, but something you are responsible for witnessing. Track repeated thoughts, emotional patterns, automatic reactions, assumptions about self and others, inner dialogue during stress and calm. Do not try to fix immediately. Do not judge, just notice. Because what is repeatedly observed begins to lose its unconscious dominance. And what loses unconscious dominance becomes available for transformation. This is the quiet mechanism behind all the teachings. Not mystical force, not secret control, but increased awareness of what was already shaping experience. The deepest paradox in all these traditions is this: nothing you are searching for is actually missing. It only appears missing when awareness is absorbed in its own patterns without recognition. The return described in mystical language is not a journey through space or time. It is a shift in identification, from being fully inside thought to being aware of thought, from being fully inside emotion to being aware of emotion, from being fully inside interpretation to recognizing interpretation as a process. And in that recognition, something stabilizes that does not depend on external conditions. This is why ancient texts often describe awakening not as gain, but as remembrance. Because what is being discovered was never absent, only unobserved, final reflection. If there is a final law hidden beneath all Hermetic, Stoic, Platonic, and psychological teachings, it is not a command, and it is not a secret formula. It is a simple shift in relationship between you and your own awareness. Once you stop mistaking every thought for truth, every emotion for instruction, and every interpretation for reality itself, something becomes clear that cannot be unseen. You are not inside reality trying to control it. You are awareness through which reality is being experienced. And from that point forward, everything changes, not because the world becomes different first, because your participation in it becomes conscious, and that is the true conclusion, not the end of knowledge, but the beginning of seeing clearly enough that knowledge is no longer required in the same way, because what remains is not belief, not technique, not system, but presence, and presence, once fully recognized, does not need to force reality. It simply reveals it.